Welcome back. So we're returning to Europe now after a little detour back in time into the American continent to talk about the Mayans. Um, so we left off with the Byzantine Empire. It was getting into the 1400s, was the end of the Byzantine Empire. Um, we noted, and many of you noted in your discussion posts, right? They were interactions with, Venetians, uh, beginnings of kind of Renaissance era Italy. So now we're going to move on to the Spanish Empire, uh, and we'll soon be interacting with, right, the native peoples of the Americas, um, much later, of course, than the Mayan civilization we studied, but the descendants of those Maya. So we're trying to bring these two worlds together in the next series of lectures. So this is a picture of sort of the largest extent of the Spanish Empire. Notice, just a few specks on the European continent, Spain, if you can see it, and then much larger territories in North and South America. Um, so in your text, the Spanish Empire and the Ottoman Empire are sort of woven together, right? Because they existed at the same time, interacted a great deal. I'm going to try to present them sort of serially best I can. First, I'm going to try to cover the Spanish interactions with the native peoples of the Americas, and then come back to the Ottoman Empire. But the Ottomans will come up from time to time, intertwined economically, and they were often at war with each other. And so much of what goes on in the Spanish Empire is uh, in part, result of their interactions with the Ottomans. So the Ottomans are here pictured, roughly covering the territory of the Byzantine Empire, right around the Mediterranean there, um, sort of centered on modern Turkey. Uh, and so they were, the Spanish Empire and the Ottoman Empire were butted up more or less right next against each other, and were well known to each other. So I'm referring to something called a Spanish Empire. That's a little bit of a stretch. I mean, that's what people sometimes call it. Um, so no country called Spain existed just yet. Um, there was, we're going to be talking primarily about Charles V as sort of the first Spanish emperor, and he was also a member of the Habsburg dynasty, which is, you can see here in yellow, uh, located around what's now sort of Germany and Austria. He was also Holy Roman Emperor, right? And the Holy Roman Empire is just took the sort of the Roman name as sort of a status, but it was not directly related to the Roman Empire. It was sort of revived 300 years after the fall of Rome. Papacy, right? The popes continued from the days of Rome, um, and the Pope sort of constituted a kind of Roman Empire. So it's a bit of to call it an empire is it's fairly messy, right? There's a lot of different Habsburgs with different degrees of power bouncing around, and then we've also got the sort of like Spain as well, as we'll see in a moment. Here's what was going on in Spain. The Romans called this area Hispania, we call it now Spain, but at the time, in the late 1400s, there were five independent kingdoms: Castile, Aragon, Portugal, Granada, and Navarra. Um, Granada was still ruled by a Muslim king. The rest of the territories were Catholic, so at least they shared a religion, even if they were politically distinct. And even to call these kingdoms is, I mean, they were kings, but these kings did not enjoy anything like absolute power. Um, so this was a feudal system. You may recall when we talked about the Byzantine Empire, the reform they made, where soldiers were paid with inheritable land grants, right? And this sort of kick-started this feudal system where you had nobles and lords that had, you know, lands of various sizes, right? And then they had sort of peasant serfs that worked the land for them um, in exchange for a percentage of the goods. And some of these lords became quite powerful, had their own private armies, alliances amongst themselves. Um, and so the kings were not always necessarily much more powerful than, their most powerful nobles and lords in their kingdom. And what they had was, in essence, a contractual arrangement with the more powerful lords, but they could not push them around um, beyond a certain point. So we have this sort of scattered and limited power, right, among these kings. Um, so there's constant maneuvering to solidify, enhance, expand your power, and one way to do that was with strategic marriages. So an important such marriage for our story is between Ferdinand and Isabella. You, those names may sound familiar, right? Uh, they come up with Columbus, right? Christopher Columbus. So Ferdinand was heir to the throne of Aragon, one of the Spanish kingdoms. Isabella, heiress of Castile, another of the Spanish kingdoms. So marriage sort of joined those kingdoms, made them the dominant force in Spain. Um, it was not a permanent sort of uniting of those kingdoms, right? So there was a marriage contract that specified that once Isabella died, Castile would go on to her heirs, right? Not necessarily um, go with Ferdinand's side. But working together, they managed to take over Granada and uh, end the last Muslim rulership in Spain. So this is in 1492. The Pope dubbed them Catholic kings, and that was sort of enhanced their status, right? They had a certain religious authority. They became definitely the dominant force in the area. After the conquest of Granada, Ferdinand and Isabella began to attempt to rid Spain of all non-Catholics. So this would have included Jews and Muslims. Protestants weren't around quite yet, although they would be coming around soon. Um, so if you were Jewish, you either had to convert to Catholicism or you had to leave. Uh, Similarly, at first, the Muslims were allowed to keep their faith, but recall that these Spanish rulers were constantly having various degrees of war with the Ottomans, right, who were right there on their borders. The Ottoman Empire was a Muslim empire, and so that made them fairly suspicious of Muslims at home. Were they spies? Were they seeking to undermine uh, Spanish kingdoms? And so eventually Muslims also were forced to convert to Catholicism or leave the area as well. So this is the beginning of what we will come to be known as the Spanish Inquisition, right, which was a wide-ranging attack on any non-Catholics or anyone suspected to be heretical or in any way the Catholic hegemony. And the Spanish Inquisition continued in one form or another until 1834. Here we see someone being burned. Yeah, Spanish Inquisition got pretty ugly. So, because these Spanish kings, again, were limited in their power, vis-a-vis the lords and the nobles within their kingdom, uh, that meant they had limited power to extract wealth from the population. They couldn't just tax these lords and nobles wanted or needed to. They needed other sources of income. So trade became one such source of income. So you take out a loan from a Italian merchant, right? That funds a ship, a galleon that will go uh, to India, right? Asia, if you can make it there, pick up some goods for cheap, right? Spices or silk, or something else that's fairly expensive back in Europe. And if you can make the trip, right, pick up the goods, bring them back, and sell them at a huge profit without sinking or otherwise dying of scurvy or something, then you make a ton of money, right? Um, So this sort of trade risky, but also very profitable if it went well. This eventually develops into the slave trade, right? When the Americas are discovered, we get this sort of triangle of capturing, right, people from Africa, shipping them over to the American Caribbean islands where sugar was produced, and then the sugar was shipped back to Europe and so on. And it was very profitable, if also uh, terribly inhumane. So Isabella's grandson was Charles V. So he became ruler of Castile, right? As we said, Isabella's in the marriage contract. Isabella's descendants were to continue to rule Castile, but Charles's father was from Belgium and was a member of the Habsburg dynasty. Uh, so he had kingdoms in Spain and in Belgium. He became later Holy Roman Emperor over there, and at that point he took the title of Charles V. He then married a Portuguese princess and really spent much of his time in Spain. So he's got territories scattered sort of all over Europe, in Spain, Portugal, and Belgium, Austria. And these territories were quite rich. Uh, his ancestors had been strategically marrying, right, for generations, and so they had picked out the best little spots, but it was quite a sort of a wide and scattered sort of empire. Um, and much of his time was taken up defending all these various scattered territories against, other kings, including other Habsburgs who were often fighting each other as well. Um, and this is sort of a constant in Charles's reign. It's just sort of constantly trying to keep a hold on this rich but very difficult to defend sort of kingdom or empire. Um, Also, during Charles's reign, the Protestant Reformation begins, right? So now we have a whole new version of Christianity that is pushing against Catholicism's dominance and threatening the territorial integrity of the Holy Roman Empire as well, the whole while also fighting the Ottoman Empire and all of this warfare fairly expensive. So, what ended up saving Charles's empire from obscurity, and the reason that we're talking about him now, uh, which is, and we'll also come talk about Philip II, who is his son, right, and who inherited the empire. Uh, but it just so happened that his grandmother, right, his grandparents Isabella and Ferdinand, had funded Columbus's expedition in 1492, right? Columbus's goal was to find a western route to China, right, to sail around the world and get to China. Unfortunately, America got in the way, so he didn't make it to China, but he did arrive in the Caribbean. And uh, the first thing, right, that Columbus was able to get out of that trip was gold and silver. So they noticed that the locals had gold and silver items, and they through quite brutal means. I think in the next lecture I'll get into a bit of the sorts of interactions, right, that happen between these Spanish conquerors and the native people. One is quite ugly, but they extracted um, a good amount of gold and silver, right, from the Americas and shipped it back to Spain, um, and also started to begin develop this international slave trade as well. So this discovery, right, of uh, the Caribbean uh, by the Europeans, right, discovered it obviously been there for a long time, right, but it was the first Europeans that heard from it, and they managed to extract a good deal of wealth from it, and this helped pay for all of Charles's expensive wars. So other European kingdoms and empires noticed, right, all of the wealth that Charles V was bringing back to Spain, and so they all wanted to get in on the deal. And so Portugal was the other significant colonial power at this time. So in 1494, Spain and Portugal came to an agreement and sort of carved up their spheres of influence in the global colonization and trade business. So Portugal got Brazil, Asia, and Africa, and Spain got the Caribbean. Um, so they were getting a little big for their britches, right? Deciding to carve up the world, right? So, I mean, in reality, they didn't have very many people. It's not like they had taken over and repopulated Americas with Spanish people. Right? There was, a steady trickle of expeditions of a few hundred men. Um, they'd send a boat over, they'd try to bring back something, right, to make some money. Maybe they plant a flag or something, but it was a vast continent. So, um, to say they right those pictures, the map I showed you at the beginning, right, with this huge chunk of territory um, that was colored yellow, indicating that it was Spanish. I mean, how much of that territory could they really govern or control? Not a lot. There weren't that many Spanish people there. But there was a significant asymmetry in the weapons system. So uh, the Aztec and Inca empires were conquered by Europeans, Europeans. So there weren't that many of them, but they did have a significant advantage, weaponry, and that did help them to control territories to some degree. Meanwhile, lots of silver and gold are coming back. It's keeping these European empires afloat, and this meant that these European empires needed to make sure, like, that this wealth was flowing back to them and not getting diverted, right? So you might imagine that a merchant, right, or someone that sent out on a ship and gets a lot of wealth, they might come back and decide that they would rather not give the king his cut, right, if they could get away from it. Um, so there was Charles set up systems to try to control that and make sure that he got his fair share back. So ships were only allowed to use certain ports. Very specific coins were instituted, um, had to be used, and all this was to make sure that the government got its share of the proceeds of this exploitation of the Americas. So, we begin with really these raids, is what you might call them, right? These ships, a few hundred men, go in there, try to grab as much gold and silver as they can, slaughter a decent number of native peoples, and then escape back to Europe. Um, it started to develop into more permanent European colonies, um, and they needed some sort of cistern system of government, right? So the nice thing about this for uh, emperors like Charles V is in the Americas, he didn't have to deal with feudal lords, right, and nobles. He didn't have to negotiate with anyone. It could be pretty much a top-down sort of authoritarian sort of colonies. So the emperor would appoint a governor, pretty much decide how he wanted um, territories run, and pretty much dictate, right, how he wanted things to go there. But there were practical limits on the power, right? So there were slave rebellions. There's always the worry in every empire we've ever talked about of the intermediaries, right? These governors or whoever you're depending on in the far-flung of your empire. Um, you need to keep them incentivized to uh, do what you want them to do instead of go their own way and try to enrich themselves. So we did have more and more people. If you've got a colony, you've got to populate it. And so we did have settlers sort of trickling into the Americas and going there to live. Uh, they were largely sort of independent, kind of profit-minded adventurers, right? So they wanted to make their fortune. And you might wonder why people with that sort of position would submit to what we just said was the kind of more authoritarian sort of government that you find in the colonies. But when you're that far from, Europe, there are some benefits to having the support of an empire that might make you willing to put up with that sort of government. First of all, this is a very risky enterprise that you're involved in, right? Trade on the high seas. Um, there are pirates. Here's a sort of a picture of a pirate, right? So you also had other empires and their ships. So getting into a ship and sailing across, right, the Atlantic Ocean, uh, you could be sunk at any moment by a pirate or by an enemy empire, or just simply, right, go off course and get lost. So having, you know, the military of a Spanish Empire on your side was kind of crucial to the whole success of the whole enterprise. And colonizing is a lonely business, so some sense of unity with other Catholics was fairly important, right? Um, I'm not saying much about the viewpoint of the folks being colonized here, and I just want to flag this and say, yeah, I am going to talk about that, right? This is not necessarily a heroic story, right, of the success of uh, Europeans. It's a devastating story for the right the people that were already living in the Americas. So we will get into that in a later lecture. So Charles V, before his death, divided his empire into two, right? So we recall he had sort of his Central European, sort of Austrian, German, Habsburg, Holy Roman Empire that he inherited from his father, going along with his Spanish Empire from his grandmother, Isabella. And so he divided into two, the European and the Spanish halves. So the European side was bogged down in these wars and squabbles among the Habsburgs and the other local rulers. They were also dealing with Protestant revolts. Protestantism was becoming a more and more powerful movement. And the Spanish and Italian part of the empire went to Philip II. So Philip II didn't take the title of emperor. He did strategically marry the daughter of King Henry VIII of England. So for at least for a brief period there, he was King of England technically, although he didn't actually rule, and the title didn't pass to his descendants at all. Um, and then we find that the next English monarch was actually Queen Elizabeth, and they became fierce enemies. And time, Philip gained control of Portugal, right, and all of its colonies. So again, the Spanish and Portuguese, who had, you know, somewhat grandiosely carved up the New World, um, are now sort of unified under Philip II. He also colonized the Philippines, so named after Philip, right? So if you have any heritage, that's where the name comes from. So Philip was also constantly at war on pretty much all fronts, including with the Ottoman Empire, but his biggest and most remembered conflict was with England, right, with Elizabeth. You may have heard of the Spanish Armada. So this was Philip II. He sent a huge fleet of Spanish ships to attack England, the English homeland. Um, he ended up losing that. His fleet was defeated, but it sort of could have gone either way. And it's interesting to speculate on if it had gone his way. This was the strongest sort of Protestant empire, um, and if Philip II had won, it's interesting to speculate on how history would have been different. But as it turns out, he did lose the battle. The Armada was sunk, and at the same time, this flow of silver and gold from the Americas was beginning to slow down. Um, there was not an endless. There were stories of sort of like endless cities of gold, but really there were um, kind of fairly few little trinkets. There weren't any giant veins of gold that hadn't been discovered. Um, so that flow began to slow down, and then also the local, people were finding ways to get around giving the emperor his share. Uh, so by the time of his death, Philip had still a very large and very rich empire, but it was a bit precarious, but still intact. So we're going to stop with the Spanish there for now, And I'm going to pick up in the next lecture with more on the interaction with the native peoples in America. See you then.